Hello and welcome to this special edition of 1152 Club to celebrate Women's History Month. My name is Hannah Cullen and I recently completed a Masters in Social History at Leeds Beckett University. My dissertation focused on Leeds Arts Club and its links with the women's suffrage campaign. This research highlighted how the club had many women members and leaders, but like many other examples in women's history, their achievements were often overlooked. Today we'll look at a few individual women with links to the club and piece together their hidden lives. Leeds Arts Club was founded in 1903 by two men, Alfred Orridge and Holbrook Jackson, running until 1923. Most of this time was spent at 8 Blenheim Terrace, opposite Leeds University. Over the years, it became a centre for debating radical and progressive ideas, hosting regular lectures and exhibitions of art. Two of its famous honorary members were cultural icons, George Bernard Shaw and William Butler Yeats, and this blue plaque has created a lasting record of these connections. Sadly, there aren't any records for the club, which means that the majority of the existing research was published in a book entitled Alfred Orridge and the Leeds Arts Club by Tom Steele. Since 1990, when the book was first published, the digitisation of many sources has meant that details about these women's lives are now more easily available. This includes newspapers, electoral registers, and census and probate records. Without definitive records, it's even more challenging to identify individual women members and research their lives. Although Leeds Arts Club welcomed and encouraged women to join, local newspaper reports and coverage of club events were focused on men. These reports often only refer to women by surname alone, or even their married surname, and don't detail their contributions to events or debates. There were some prominent Leeds women who are associated with the club, and all of them had connections to the women's suffrage campaign. The first was Isabella Ormston Ford, who was a writer, socialist, activist, and suffragist, and she was one of three women on the first committee of Leeds Arts Club. Mary Gawthorpe, a well-known suffragette and regional organiser for the Women's Social and Political Union, joined the club in its early days. And finally, Leonora Cohen, another suffragette from Leeds, famous for smashing a case in the Tower of London, was a member of Leeds Arts Club. She designed and made this dress for the Fancy Dress Ball in 1913, which is held by Leeds museums and galleries. Event listings in the Votes for Women newspaper revealed that regular meetings of the Women's Social and Political Union were held at Leeds Arts Club between 1908 and 1909. This represented the militant wing of the women's suffrage campaign. The club was also used as an address for correspondence, and upcoming meetings were posted on the walls. At this time, the city didn't have its own branch of WSPU, and the one in Bradford was much more active, so this could have played an important role in the development of the campaign in Leeds. The first of our individual women was MABEL BRUNTON, who was born in Leeds in 1870 to Scottish parents. Her father was an eminent dentist and later became president of the British Dental Association. MABEL had two sisters, one older and one younger, and the family lived quite a middle-class existence with at least one servant. The census shows that they lived at several addresses in the area of Woodhouse Lane and finally settled at 16 Blenheim Terrace. Tom Steele explains that MABEL BRUNTON was on the first committee of Leeds Arts Club when it formed in 1903, and at this time it was based at 18 Park Lane, which can be seen on the left of this image. It's not clear how MABEL would have known the founders, but she was already an established artist by this time. On the 1891 census, her occupation is given as art student, and by 1901, it is art metal worker and designer. An article in the Queen magazine in November 1895 suggests that she may have trained at the Royal Female School of Art in London. And Miss MABEL M. Brunton had won a prize in an exhibition of students' work held in Queen Square, Bloomsbury. If this is true, MABEL reflects a trend during this time for middle-class women to study arts and crafts, as it was considered to be more appropriate for them than other subjects. But it's worth noting that this particular institution didn't just allow women to study the arts, their aim was to give them the practical skills to generate an income for themselves. In December 1910, MABEL and her sister had work exhibited by Leeds Arts Club itself. According to the Yorkshire Post, MABEL's silverwork and jewellery showed strong Celtic influence and unusual artistic value, reflecting their Scottish heritage. Following the deaths of her mother in 1911 and her father in 1918, MABEL appears to have made the decision to move to Kirkcudbright in Scotland, which was an artists' colony, experiencing an influx of new artists at the time. Valuation rolls for Kirkcudbright show that she first rented property on High Street in 1919, in the heart of its artistic community. Jessie Marion King, the Scottish artist and illustrator known for her Art Nouveau style, was a key figure in this community and lived nearby. Mabel then bought a bungalow next to Kirkcudbright Park. Hay Gordon, who wrote a book on the artists of Kirkcudbright, relayed an anecdote from a local that although Mabel was quite a reclusive character, Jessie King had managed to persuade her to appear in one of her pageants. Mabel died in Edinburgh in 1953, but her address at the bungalow in Kirkcudbright was given in her will. She outlived both of her sisters and never married. The second of our women is Bertha Eleanor Doyle. She was born in Leeds in 1874. Like Mabel, her family also lived on Blenheim Terrace for many years, along with servants. Her father was a glass merchant and owned premises on Boar Lane. Bertha had been a prize-winning student at Leeds School of Art, and by the time Leeds Arts Club was founded, she'd already established herself as an artist, described here as belonging to a little coterie of lady artists in Leeds. In October and November 1903, the Leeds Mercury advertised the sale of an extensive and valuable collection of work sold by Edmund Bogg, who was a local art dealer. This collection included work from Bertha Doyle, along with many other male artists. Other reports in the Leeds Mercury show that her watercolour work appeared in more than one exhibition at Leeds City Art Gallery. In November 1906, her watercolour drawings also appeared in a small but significant exhibition of Leeds Arts Club members' work at the Club Rooms in Park Lane. This exhibition was described in the Leeds Mercury as reflecting a high standard of artistic thought and execution. And actually, Bertha is the only woman who has work mentioned in this article. At some point, Bertha became involved with the Women's Social and Political Union. When the WSPU opened a shop on Albion Street in late 1909, the Votes for Women newspaper records Bertha volunteering her artistic skills to draw cartoons to place in what was described as its unusually large window. Later, in May 1911, ahead of the coronation procession in London, Bertha pledged to design and stencil a banner to represent the branch. Bertha joined the Leeds Arts Club Committee in 1910, and in 1912, she married then Honorary Secretary of Leeds Arts Club, Robert Ernest Wilkinson. He was also a suffragist and showed support for the WSPU. This could have meant that Bertha had influence over the use of the club rooms. After this point, it isn't too clear what happened to Bertha. Her husband ran 2 blouse factories during World War I and the early 1920s, one in Meanwood and another in Clifford near Boston Spa. Electoral registers show her living in Boston Spa and Clifford at this time, although apparently not with her husband. One newspaper report suggests that Robert was recognised as a conscientious objector, meaning that he would have been disqualified from voting for 5 years after the war, due to the terms of the 1918 Representation of the People Act. Later, Bertha lived at the Old Swan Hotel in Harrogate, and it was given as her address when she died in 1961. This hotel is actually quite famous because this was where Agatha Christie was found when she disappeared for 10 days in 1926. Bertha's will states that she was the wife of Robert Wilkinson, but she'd apparently lived alone at the hotel for many years. Next, we have Dorothy Wilkinson. She was the sister of Robert Ernest Wilkinson, and so also the sister-in-law of Bertha Doyle. She was born in Leeds in 1888, and the family actually lived at 8 Blenheim Terrace before Leeds Arts Club moved there in 1908. Like Mabel Brunton and Bertha Doyle, her family had lived around Woodhouse Lane for many years. Her father, Charles Wilkinson, was a professor of music and organised many concerts in the city. He had spent time in Berlin and Cologne, where he had met Dorothy's German mother, Anna. Reports in the Leeds Mercury and Yorkshire Post show that as a young woman, Dorothy often accompanied her father and other musicians on the piano. This included an event at Leeds Arts Club in November 1909, when she accompanied a singer called Ethel Richardson. As an accompanist, newspaper reports wouldn't often comment on her performance. Since her father and at least 2 of her brothers were involved in Leeds Arts Club, and there was a musical section in the club, it seems likely that she was also there regularly. Dorothy actually features in a book called Stories from the War Hospital, written by Richard Wilcox from Leeds. This book contains true stories about the World War I military hospital at Beckett Park in Headingley. Richard was lucky enough to speak with Dorothy's son, who gave lots of information on her life after the beginning of the First World War. There is some evidence that Dorothy supported the women's suffrage campaign and owned a badge representing the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. This was separate to the WSPU and represented the constitutional wing of the women's suffrage campaign, meaning that they didn't believe in the militant methods employed by the WSPU. In June of 1916, Dorothy married Dr. Clifford Crawshaw Pickles in Boston Spa, where her family had moved at the start of the war. Dr. Pickles had returned from France with a severe case of shell shock, and Dorothy visited him while he was at Beckett Park Military Hospital. Sadly, Dr. Pickles died only a few months later in December. Shortly after his death, Dorothy applied to become a voluntary aid detachment nurse at Beckett Park Hospital, and this is where she met her second husband, Dr. Alfred Huckett, who she eventually married in 1919 in Headingley. Following their marriage, Dorothy moved to Doncaster to live with him. She had 3 children with her husband and died in 1974. If you'd like to read more about Dorothy, you can pick up stories from the War Hospital via Leeds Libraries. Finally, Dorothea Foster was born in Leeds in 1880. She was the daughter of Leeds artist William Gilbert Foster, but she was also an artist in her own right. The image here is believed to be a picture of her as a young girl taken by her father in Collingham. In March 1903, she married Reginald Hurst, a woolen manufacturer at Whitkirk Parish Church, and moved to Staincliffe in Batley with him. A month later, the Leeds Mercury reported that she had several paintings hung at the Royal Academy, along with some by her father. Over the next few years, her work featured in several exhibitions at Leeds City Art Gallery, which was largely crafted items like boxes and a decorated letter rack in 1909. It was also during this decade that she had 2 daughters. Dorothea's father was known to Leeds Arts Club and had spoken to its members in the past. In December 1914, Dorothea contributed work to an exhibition organised by the club in aid of the Belgian Relief Fund. The exhibition focused on paintings of Belgian subjects, and Leeds Mercury includes Dorothea in its list of well-known artists who had work featured. At some point in the 1920s, Dorothea became separated from her husband, no longer appearing on the electoral registers for their home in Clifford near Boston Spa. This quotation is taken from an article in the Westminster Gazette in 1927, which reveals that she has developed a technique in hand-painted lacquer in her studio near London. After the death of her first husband, early in 1937, she married a Scottish architect named William Bell in Buckinghamshire. Later, Dorothea, like Mabel Brunton, retired with her husband to the artist's town of Kirkcaldy and died there in 1966. This has been only a small number of women's stories, and while their experiences vary, it's important to remember that all of these women were middle class. This undoubtedly gave them advantages in pursuing their artistic work and in living the long lives that they did, but it also makes them a little easier to research. They represent many other women who interacted with the club, whom we may never know more about. Thank you for listening today.